Hi, good morning. My name is Aaron Hughes. I'm the CEO of 6Connect. And Jen asked me to do a presentation on IPv6 at ISPs, and I thought to myself, well, we all in these communities generally know quite a bit about dual stacking backbones, but I need a clicker. Ah, here we go. Does this work? Yeah, okay. But we don't really talk a lot about in these communities of what IPv6 for ISPs looks like holistically. And when we think about it, we use a single measuring stick, right? We look at the total traffic that is V6 on the global internet by well-known measures like Google, and they can come back and say we've reached X%, and we all go, yay, that number is going up and to the right. But it doesn't really give us a sense of the state inside of each ISP and where we really are with V6 implementations. And I find that the perception is actually different from all different kinds of people that you talk to. Where when you talk to people on the network side, they say, yep, we're dual stacked, we're done. Backbone's good, peers are done, transit's good, traffic goes through on V6 and V4. That's the end of the story. You talk to people that are in sales or sales engineering, and they will say things like, yep, we have that, it's supported, or maybe they don't even know about it. A lot of DevOps people really believe that they don't have to do all that much. You know, occasionally you'll talk to DevOps and they'll, sorry? Development operations staff, so people that write tools, work internally for, you know, helping with system support. You know, and outside of the minor, we have to change, you know, 4 integers into understanding what a V6 address is. They really don't think they have to do all that much. And system support staff generally think things like, well, I have to change one little bit in a config file and up a process or restart a service and we're done. And cloud providers are really interesting, right? When you talk to them, generally if you go to buy a VM instance, you can certainly get a V6 address on the VM. So that's kind of the rough things that I hear. So this is really about exploring the realities. So what I did is I called a bunch of friends, you know, work at ISPs and cloud providers, small and large, different countries, and just got a sense of where people were. And you know, trying to figure out a way to actually measure this is a little challenging, and maybe, you know, I can take something like this and come up with something tangible for a repeat interview or survey format. You know, if this is considered useful to say, where are we actually at in terms of V6 implementation in ISPs? So this is sort of a stab at that. There'll be a couple of examples in here where I've taken specific interviews and documented what the results were. And then there's some aggregated data at the end of this. So there's 3 or 4 examples in here of people I talked to and their specific answers to these questions. So this first one was a small Canadian ISP. They basically said, you know, we had a simple V6 plan. It was phased over time. You know, they were going to start with BGP in the core, which made perfect sense, and add transit and peers over time. And as part of server refreshes, they enabled V6 functionality, you know, over time, or sort of one at a time or a couple at a time. They found some things had to be deprecated, and some outlying systems had to be replaced, and some network components had to be replaced. And they didn't have a large lab like many of us do. They had a fairly small lab, so they made changes in small changes at a time. And they found a couple of minor bugs, but nothing huge facing customer concerns. So in this case, you know, this is a fairly standard list, and this is what I expected to hear from everybody, was their routers, their switches, their back-end monitoring, DNS, mail, control panel web services, radius auth, backup servers, VPN, corporate firewall, you know, the standard list of things that you would think, yep, that's what we're going to dual stack and be done. And this is the lessons that he gave me along the way. So the first one, and this is common I heard, is the big unknown, right? Older servers and routers need to be updated or refreshed. Well, that's expected. Stateful firewalls for V6 not supported in Red Hat 5. There was no connection tracking. That was an interesting one. Feature parity I heard over and over again. In this case, feature parity in older Junos versions weren't there. I hear this for Cisco IOS as well, certainly. FreeRadius 1 didn't support sending V6 packets. The next lesson he gave me was, it's the small things. and I've experienced this myself. In this case, failed to ban a firewall script for blocking, didn't have v6 support. It's an experimental only. Lots of custom scripts that were written years ago were making the assumption for v6 or v4. And they used gray listing and white listing, and it had very limited v6 support. And while this is probably a somewhat slang, reverse DNS is a bind with the smiley face, he meant to say he had challenges with ISC bind. And so they migrated to Power DNS to simplify v6 reverse delegation. And I think this is probably related to the lack of tools to help with some of this automation. And again, that's sort of that DevOps, we have nothing to do, but the reality is there's a lot more to be done with tools. Another takeaway from this, and obviously we all know this one, is have a plan for your net block. But I didn't really think about this in terms of a small ISP. This person said, well, 32 is a lot of space for a small ISP, unless you're doing something really silly. And they cut these into a 36 per pop or tie down or however you want to refer to it. And each business customer got a sparse allocated 48. They've been working on this for some time. And so now they've got the majority of their services dual stacked, and they've run into some interesting problems. But effectively what he told me was that about every week or so, they turn on a service and they start a timer. And then as we're going to convert one box, we're going to watch it for 28 days. If it's successful and nothing happens, we'll go on to the next one. And they've been going through this process for some time, and their final step is just enabling v6 for their DSL and fiber customers, which they haven't done today, but they're almost there. So I talked to something slightly larger. This is a medium-sized provider in California. So you consider it fairly heavily peered, lots of transit providers, a decent-sized network that does colo, transit, managed services, et cetera. This was a little more interesting and fairly common. What I heard across the board for ISPs is that they started peers early on. In this particular case, Hurricane Electric was a huge help because they actually had full v6 tables a long time ago over v6 for peering, which made it really easy if you didn't have access to transit providers and started at the edge and worked into the core. They had trouble with their transit providers. It took some time. This was about 6 months to get everybody actually dual stacked and seeing full tables in BGP, where they had enough redundancy to do some more things and not just dependent on their IXs being dual stacked for a few providers with full tables. They had some subnet size challenges, and I think early on we kind of all had this debate about whether to use 127s or 126s or 64s on PTP links. They had started off with 64s, and I can't remember whose presentation it was, but it was some time ago. I think it was Igor from Yahoo who talked about this TTL bug where you could attack point-to-point links and packets would just bounce back and forth on the interface, and you could use it as an attack vector fairly easily. And then in this particular case, they eventually switched to 126s versus 127s because when they tried to train their operations staff or talk to their customers, nobody was really happy with the concept of one end of the link being : : 0 or just : : And this is a really interesting one. Out of all the people I talked to, it's different in almost every case. There are a good deal of people that use 126s with : : 1 and : : 2 and then discard the rest of the 64. It's probably the most common of everybody I talk to. And there are some that are actually incrementing 127s out of single 64s per region. And it looks really nasty and it's very hard to read, but people are actually doing this. So it's an interesting report to see. But I think the overwhelming majority were using 64s with : : 1, : : 2 on the other end and discarding the rest of the block. So next in this particular provider, dual stack was completed. They added Slack to a few subnets and then quickly added public-facing services. It's kind of funny when I was talking to this particular person, they were telling me that they were apprehensive initially about adding interfaces for v6 on any of their server environments because the very first one that he did, he had a VLAN with a bunch of servers on it and he only had a few of them were test and others were production. In this case, a Cisco environment, and the first time they added a subnet on an interface, of course, all of their boxes ran in Unix, picked up an address from Slack, and he inadvertently had servers that were starting to use v6 for outgoing requests, and operators ran into production bugs that they didn't know how to support. So he, more carefully started adding v6 to interfaces later. But I just thought it was kind of an interesting takeaway from the conversation was that nobody was used to Slack just being on by default and having to deal with debugging they weren't prepared for. Writing tools like IPAM was a painful process. It was a different approach for v4, a bit like feature parity issues. Internal tools took a long time to update, and training people like sales and sales engineering what things like line items for v6 blocks in Salesforce were challenging conversations to have. Another one I didn't really expect to see, but a lot of the feedback I got was that just having conversations internally with staff was a real challenge to say, hey, we're going to do something different, even if it's like a $0 line item or maybe adding to invoices to say, yep, we're actually giving you some flavor of resource to use. And this was in preparation to increase prices for the v4 utilization, but starting along the way, this actually caused some challenges internally. And I heard this over and over again as well. Like selling the story internally to staff was like talking about Y2K, right? The sky is falling, the sky's falling, we're out of v4, we're going to need to move to v6. And getting people to actually react and accept that this was a real serious change was difficult. This was a constant feedback. So over time, customer demand and trickle in slowly, and staff got to actually do some implementation and started getting some real hands-on operational experience, including customer BGP, INET6 objects, et cetera. And for this ISP, it took another year to get internal services dual stacked, which I think is probably about the range that most of us uses. Over the course of a year, it starts to flow from, the backbone's done, into supporting services internally. Some of the training issues that came up were interesting. So teaching people how to deal with PTRs for v6, and I still see this today in an overwhelming majority of things like trace routes where there's just no reverse DNS on things. And I don't know if this is because of lack of tools or training, but people, for some reason, consistently said it was hard to get people to edit zones with PTRs for v6. And filtering automation is a consistent response. In this particular case, they were using IRRPT, which I think was written by Richard Steenbergen many, many years ago, which only supports v4. And these guys were using, rancid-w and some nice little sanity scripts, and just said they really had no way to deal with v6. So they would manually generate these prefix filters. And while there are a couple solutions out there, because they were used to IRRPT, they're just waiting for v6 support. They found a lot of hard-coded references in code. Logging analysis, abuse reporting, just formatting mail into certain things. Some of their log check scripts were expecting v4 addresses. And they had some challenges with monitoring tools. This one primarily was external related. So internal tools like Nagios, Intermapper, blah, blah, et cetera, Observium, they all seem to support the idea of monitoring v4 and v6. But the dual stack monitoring services, this is again what I've heard consistently across the board. I don't know of a single external monitoring platform that actually properly supports dual stack. And I heard this over and over again. Everybody that's out there will get you to add an additional host for your v6 stack to monitor those services, rather than understanding that a host actually has multiple addresses and you want it to do the same thing on both stacks, and if there's a failure on either, to react to it. There's still no good solution that I found anywhere for dealing with things like name-based virtual hosts, where you want to have something actually happen, a transaction on an application stack, look for an expected return, and if there's a failure on either stack, alert. So this is a fairly common one. Debugging on which stack is being used is still a serious support issue. This is a consistent issue, particularly in tickets where people say, I'm having problems getting from X to Y. Still a big problem in everyone I talk to. Let's see here. Also consistent. v6 is not ingrained in decision making. This is ubiquitous. We all sort of made a commitment over the last few years to walk away and set the expectation that we're not going to work with vendors who don't support v6, whether it's hardware or software, or the future viability of your organization depends on having these things supported in the future and not making mistakes spending money now. Even consistent reminders to provisioning staff that dual stack must be the default, and when you talk to somebody about purchase, this must be included and actually fully supported, was a reoccurring issue. Downstream training is a big deal, and this primarily was pushed back from sales. I've heard this consistently, is that people don't really want to have the conversation with their customers about their v6 plan, and they have some fear about bringing the topic up because your existing customer, your prospect, might ask about your v4 inventory and use that as a metric to determine whether they should be with you or go with someone else. Feature parity, I heard this over and over and over again. All kinds of examples of serious feature parity where people would expect as they got beyond the edge of the network and just wanted to enable the same service on v6 as they had on v4, failed. Primarily in IDS, IPS, firewalls consistently heard that. Analysis for flows, logs, filtering, DNS, DHCP, and new odd behaviors where they had subnets that were dependent on v4 NAT and added a second stack of v6, and having to figure out how to create some sort of consistent policy across those interfaces. Internal support staff was also a huge issue. People that have 24/7 staff and rotating people, the level of education is now a significant difference between the people who understood dual stack and who understood v4 only. I find that a limited number of people to escalate to, and all of a sudden, if there was a problem on v6, it got escalated very quickly from tier 1 to tier 3 instead of having the same general knowledge on how to debug issues. Security was a consistent issue. Of course, it's entirely different to secure. Duplications of policies don't always work, where you go, I have the policy for v4, I'm just going to copy it to v6 and we're going to be great. NAT no longer being a DMARC actually required a unique policy, and I was surprised to hear this, particularly at service providers, but I heard this a lot, that the edge DMARC change, whether it's a downstream modem or subnet for supporting internal systems, really required a lot of thought and change in internal policy. And that there were a ton of applications that surprisingly had hard-coded bindings to v4. This was a really funny story, actually. Someone told me about sending a PGP mail where the application was just listening for the destination port and would do the encryption on the fly. And as soon as they dual stacked their SMTP servers, even if they had rules that said, encrypt this message, it's a must, if the connection outbound hit the SMTP server over v6, it just completely ignored the application and went on in the plain text. Fantastic. This, of course, is a feature request, not a bug. Cloud service providers. This was a great conversation. So, when you ask a cloud service provider on a VM to get dual stack, certainly you can get v6 addresses from most of them. But when you ask them about the management platforms for the underlying provisioning systems and management systems, I found absolutely no support for v6. None of them. And even the orchestrators of the VM platforms had no support for v6. And for most of these guys, it wasn't even on their roadmap. And nobody seems all that concerned, which I find absolutely amazing. And some of the discussions about how you actually manage these things, which are typically deployed in multiple instances of overlapping 1918 space and a management layer that does mapping back to things like OpenStack, UUIDs, the idea of adding v6 to this was just unheard of. And even the few that I talked to about what they were doing with management and starting to introduce the idea of open access on very large management VLANs or VXLANs, they wouldn't add v6 because as soon as their VM knew about a v6 address, it would actually look up the quad A and try and use it and wait for the no route to host before it would execute out the v4 default gateway. So there's some interesting issues in cloud service providers as a whole and all their management and supporting systems. And every one of them said there's just no demand for it. And I think that's because they're just not asking people to do it. Eyeball access, this was all over the place. DSL cable modems have a mixed set of support for v6 and really odd behavior. Feature parity, as far as I know, is missing from every single vendor out there, OpenWTRT being the closest to having feature parity. The rest of them were just, everybody said that there was something wrong with feature parity. Allocation customer sizes vary from all over the place, from a 64 to a 48. And I think this is an interesting one. You never really hear about this except for inside of meetings like Cable Labs, but nobody really completely talks about what they're going to do as consistent policy for their customers or what the future looks like. So right now we're in an interesting state where this is just a blend. The majority of people that responded said there was a 64 as a single connected assignment. I found that interesting. That was pretty low. Let's see, 5 minutes, let me just skip a couple of things. Okay, so conclusions. ISPs have no trouble dual stacking their backbones. That's pretty clear. The major public services were mostly easy to deploy. There were some people with very hiccups. There's still a great deal of work to do with hardware and software vendors. We all know this. Many vendors claim support for v6, but either don't work or only are partially supported. Completely missing in all evaluated cloud orchestration products. This was a surprise to me, but maybe it's not to some of you. Getting to next steps, default for v6 for all customers, service, educating staff, same as v4, is going to take a lot of time. Everybody had problems in this area. And everybody I spoke to was comfortable about talking about these kind of questions. So I thought that was great. At least it leaves the opportunity to go back and get sort of a state of v6 implementations across ISPs, although almost everyone I talked to wanted to be anonymous. And that's it.
Any ISPs in the room? ISPs who is deploying v6 now?
Hello, Rado Feurdan from Coriolis Telecom France. Thank you for pointing out that things in the IPv6 world are not that bright and shine that some people would like to believe. And IPv6 deployment, it's complicated, especially when you get up in the chain of management to CEOs and people who don't really understand what is it all about, what does it mean, and what are the implications. This is another issue. You didn't really mention it, but it does exist, and it's quite serious sometimes. We are deploying IPv6. We are having a number of issues. Mainly, people don't understand that you can't just throw in IPv6 and that's over. You no longer need IPv4. Everything is nice. They don't understand this. This is something that probably needs some more education.
Would you be willing to come and share your experience, or you prefer to stay anonymous?
Someday, yes. I can't answer right now.
I will be patiently waiting for you.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe one useful sort of generic question is an updated sort of state of ISPs a useful thing to bring to this kind of audience? Perhaps even creating a generic survey we could send out, or just, personally go out and ask people where they are and try and figure out a metric that is something other than we are at X% of traffic on the global internet for v6. Is that useful?
Probably.
Yeah. A couple head nods. Anybody just think it's a waste of time? Okay. Good enough. Jan?
Jan George. So you pretty much documented the current state of IPv6 deployment at the providers. But what surprises me is that we are still talking about IPv6 enabled, IPv6 compliant. I thought we cleared that up with RIPE 554. I don't know. Maybe you should share this. list of requirements more widely on the other side of the pond?
Yeah, I mean, I heard all kinds of stories. Do I have 30 seconds? One of my favorites was I went out for a printer search a few years ago, and I had a customer that required that they were V6 enabled. They were a government customer. And so I found all of the ones that had V6 compliance on them and bought them all and tested them. And my favorite one was I turned on a printer that says enabled V6, and as soon as I enabled V6, it got a V6 address and it turned off V4.
Oh, I really love it. We actually do not need two protocols, right? We just heard what happened if you have two configuration protocols for a host, right?
Yeah.
If you just need just one. Must be only one.
Question in the back?
I have a quick comment. And so Peter Hessler with HostServer in Germany. And I've seen in a few test networks where I set up a dual stack V4 and V6 network, got everything working, turned off V4, and then suddenly everything broke because I didn't realize that there was a number of V4 services that were fully dependent, and I was not actually utilizing all of the V6 and not actually testing all the V6 services that I thought I was. So for people that are implementing a dual stack, it is important for them to also test the V6 pure network. Maybe not deploy it yet if it doesn't make sense for them, but to keep that in mind that you are likely to run into a lot of problems.
It's a great comment.
Any more questions, or people just need coffee so desperately? So I think it concludes the session. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you.
Guys, last, please rate talks because we need to know what you'd like to hear about.